Graham, could you give us a flavor of what it was like to be in Coventry around 1960 when things were really going, well, that was not a very good financial year for Triumph, but when they had new models coming out and they were a vibrant car company and they were racing at Le Mans. What was it like to be there?
I was young in Coventry at the time. I started my working life as a junior design engineer at Jaguar, and I got to know the Triumph people obviously from the social scene,
Right.
and joined the motor clubs, and that's where eventually I met Harry Webster, who was very much my mentor at Triumph. Coventry was full of motor industry at the time. I mean, I counted up recently something like 14 or 15 different makes of car were being made in Coventry at the time. It was the centre of the British motor industry. Most things that seemed to happen that were new in Coventry were connected with motor cars. That was the scene. Very vibrant, very enjoyable, the place to be.
What was Triumph's part of that? Were they a little car company? Were they a major player? Give us a flavor for how big Triumph was in Coventry.
Coventry had, as I said, up to 15 brands of car, but many of them were very small production.
Right.
The three big groups were what we used to call the Roots Group,
Right.
which was Hillman, Sunbeam, Humber, Singer. That was all family cars except for the Alpine sports car.
Right.
Then there was Jaguar, which became Jaguar Daimler almost immediately at the time we're talking about.
Right.
But the other big employer was Standard Triumph, or the Standard Motor Company. Now Standard were not only building standard motor cars, they were building Triumph motor cars, which were all TRs at the time. And of course, what made all the money for them was they were also making under license Ferguson tractors.
Right. Focusing on the cars, we here in America always loved the TR. But over in England, it was a different story because they really made their money, Triumph did, on sedans and other cars. But was the TR, did it excite the British driver as much as it did the American one?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Most of the money, most of the profit came from the sedans, but the excitement was always with the TRs. And of course, by 1962, and we're jumping ahead just a bit, came the Spitfire as well.
Right.
So when Triumph found themselves making TRs on one production line and Spitfires on the production line next week, very exciting time to be around in Coventry because they were both successes, they were both pretty, they were both selling jolly well, and they had this wonderful image. But as I said, the profits came from the sedans and the wagons.
Those of us who have read your books know that Triumph, or we get the idea that Triumph was a really scrappy car company that did a lot of really great things on a shoestring budget. We're talking about disc brakes, fuel injection, things of that nature. Where did that spirit come from? Did it come from Harry Webster?
Yes, it did. There are people who didn't like Harry because they said he was a corner cutter. But Harry knew he had to keep producing innovations quickly, cheaply, and reliably. And he had a team around him who frankly adored him. It was a personal thing. He was a great man to work for. And his management, which became Leyland at the time we're talking about in the 60s, they encouraged him to produce new models. He would have, say, 2 or 3 bases. One basis was the Herald Vitesse Spitfire line, and then the TRs, of course, were a line on their own. He just was always, as we said in English, he was always up for a fight, up for a battle, up for an innovation. And as long as Harry could keep on producing the models with very little development money and very little time, as long as those cars could then come through to the marketplace and sell, everyone loved what was done. And it worked.
Would you tell us one of your favorite anecdotes about Harry Webster? One of the things fondest memories?
The fond anecdote is one that some of us weren't fond about at the time. That Harry Webster, who unfortunately died in early 2007, great guy in many ways, but he had this reputation, I will only use it as a reputation, that on a Friday, Harry would come wandering down into the engineering workshops and say, I'm going to Turin tonight. Now Turin, Italy is maybe 600 miles, 700 miles from Coventry. I'm going to Turin tonight. What can I take? What? Being a prototype. Now, the factory would have, the experimental department would have maybe 3 or 4 hours to think, well, Harry's going to come down, isn't he? What can we do? And they would make sure that the prototype they wanted him to drive was available. So on Friday afternoon, Harry would arrive with his small weekend case, and off he would go in a precious prototype. I mean, we're talking of days when, say, there would only be 2 or 3 Triumph TR4s hand-built before production began, 2 or 3 Spitfires. Harry would go off to Turin. He would leave the factory on Friday afternoon. He would go overnight. In those days, there was no channel tunnel, so it would be a ferry across the English Channel and drive and drive and drive. He would get to Turin, Italy on Saturday lunchtime, Saturday early afternoon, to see Michelotti, the stylist. He would then spend the rest of Saturday, much of Saturday evening if exciting things are doing, crash out on Saturday night, do some more work on Sunday morning and turn around and come back. On Monday morning, Harry would come back into the office looking a bit scruffy because he was by that time in his 40s and 50s, but with a razor sharp mind, he would then list exactly what he'd found wrong with these cars. That was the anecdote. In other words, it was how he operated his business. People respected him for that.
Focusing back on the cars, does it surprise you that just about every car that Triumph built is now collectible, is now being restored? I can't think of another car company when you look at everything from the most base model Heralds to the 1300 Dolomites to all the TRs, even the Stag, has become a sought-after collectible.
Some more than others. In fact, in fairness, even by collector's car standards, there are very few Heralds being kept now because Heralds are not worth a lot of money to restore.
Right.
But basically, whether or not they were good cars and reliable cars, most of them were, they all had huge character. Now, you would probably agree with me that neither you nor I would want to own a car that was what in English we call great porridge. Not just a car that was a car.
Right.
We want a car that's got great character. They all had great character. I mean, after all, if somebody gave you a chance to buy a perfectly good TR3A and restore it, you would do that. Right. So that was the joy of the Triumph business, the Triumph brand at the time, that most of the cars did have character and it worked.
I was going to ask you about character because it varies from car to car, and in a Triumph, to me, the character is the noise the engine makes, or it's the view you get looking out over the hood. What do you think the character is in the Triumph that makes people love them so many years after they've been out?
Well, it's good, honest character, if that's the word we can use. The cars were ruggedly simple. Even things like Spitfires and GT6s with all independent suspension, rugged and simple. Relatively easy to restore, I suggest. And it was the whole company, it wasn't just the engineering department. The management team themselves were young and keen. Some of them were still involved in motorsport in their own little way. They were not accountants, they were not number crunchers, they were not marketing specialists, they were enthusiasts. And Coventry was like that. The people who were enthusiasts tended to move to companies like Triumph, like Jaguar. And that read across through the cars that went on sale.
About a year ago, to this very day, I went to Coventry, and I got off at the train station in Canley and walked around, and I saw the streets named after the cars, and I felt a little sad because of all the great things that went on here. Do you ever look back and think to yourself, what if things went another way? What if maybe Rover and Triumph didn't merge with Leyland?
It's interesting, isn't it, to play the how nice it would have been thing. The sad fact is that the entire complex of factories in which the Triumphs that we love were made, the entire complex is now gone. Right. The entire complex site has been, start again, I'll go blank for a minute.
Okay.
The entire Canley site has now been flattened and redeveloped. I noticed downstairs here at the convention in 2007, on display is a historic brick that was stolen by one of the members when he came across the Canley site when it was being redeveloped. So the Canley site's been redeveloped and only the names remain, and of course the monument that I hope you see.
I did see that.
Fine.
I asked where it was, and it's in front of a daycare center. And
the daycare center being a part of the recreation club, which was the employees' recreation club. Only earlier in 2007, the Ferguson tractor factory was flattened as well, because times had moved on. In other words, Coventry is not Japan. It's an awful thing to say. Coventry is not Japan. Most of the heavy industry from Coventry has moved on to other countries. The other plant that not many people know about in the north of Coventry, where all the engines were made, which was called the Radford plant, has also been flattened as well. So there is very little now of the Coventry left that I used to know when I was a young man.
Do you think there's a future for the Triumph brand? We've seen BMW bring back the Mini, and it's been very successful. Do you see a future for it, or is Triumph forever now going to be in the past?
Well, I have my own opinions, and I have made myself a thorough nuisance with BMW and Mini, who I know quite well.
Right.
Because occasionally I sit down sociably with one or two of their directors and say, why don't we?
Yeah.
The situation, the legal situation is that BMW owns the brand.
Right.
No question about this. No matter what you read anywhere else in the world, BMW own the brand. They, I think, would like to think that they could revive the Triumph brand somehow. It is agreed that they will probably not do it as what in American English you call badge engineering. It won't be basically a BMW with a new badge. If they do it, they'll do it as a new motor car. If they do it, and it's an if, I think it will be based on the Mini, which is the small size, if you like a Spitfire size, not on the bigger cars.
And those of us who know Triumph history know that Triumph built some front-wheel drive cars before, so it could work. But what sort of attributes would any kind of new Triumph have to to be true to the brand that we know and love?
Don't think for a minute that BMW haven't analysed this to death. BMW is a very Germanic, a very analytical, a very deep thinking company. They've been analysing this for the last few years. What might we do if,
Right.
what might we do? And they would want it to be a sporting car, no question. That they've immediately divined the fact that Triumph as a brand is one that they've bought, it has got an image. The one thing they were reluctant to do when came the divorce, as we call it, in 2000 from Rover, they were reluctant to let MG go, because they recognise that MG also has a sporting image.
Right.
So if and when, and if the money was there and the priorities were right, any Triumph that was reborn, I'm sure, would be either a sports car or a very sporty car.
Okay.
And as I said, I suspect, because of the way the world is, because the Mini is made in England,
Right.
I suspect a new Triumph would be Mini-based. But I've got nothing very concrete to base that on at the moment.
Okay. Now, one last question for you. Looking back at all the cars that Triumph built, if there are no future Triumphs at all, what do you think the car that Triumph will be most remembered for? Which model do you think it would be?
You would expect me to say the TR, and you would be right. Because the car that turned round Triumph from really very little to worldwide fame, particularly in North America, was the TR2, TR3. Looking outside at the convention I'm at in 2007, it's amazing how many really nice TR3s and 3As there are here. That's the car that transformed the brand from a brand that was making pretty awful, ordinary sedans and roadsters into a new sports car company. Let's never forget that until 1953, Triumph made no competitor at all for the MG company. Within 3 or 4 years, MG was running scared of it and remained that way for the next 25 years.
Right.
That, I think, is the car people will always remember.
Is there any particular TR model? In the U.S., the TR6 is greatly loved, so I might throw that into consideration. But is there any particular TR model that you think would be the one?
I love the TR3A because of the numbers that it sold. I thought that the fact that it was a facelift worked remarkably well, and the sales figures prove it. The TR3A was exactly the car for the time. It sold in big numbers in North America. It was apparently extremely good value for money and all that stuff. I think that's the car I love. I personally would, this is deeply unfashionable to say this, I personally would like to own a very nice TR8 convertible as well.
Really? You know, that's another car that's really come into its own in the last couple of years, the TR7 and the TR8. People have found ways to make them more reliable, and the styling.
If the TR8 had been launched and available 2 or 3 years earlier than it was, and it should have been, I mean, we've all read the history and we know what the delays were about. If the TR8 had been available when it should have been ready in 1977-78, I think most people would agree it would have sold much better because it would have been on sale in the United States before V8 engines became unfashionable. It would have been a much more successful car than it was. But as I said, I would love to have a really nice, reliable, low mileage convertible, please.
All right. Is there anything you would like to talk about that I did not ask you?
I think my lasting memories of Triumph will always be not necessarily the motor cars, because they were equivalently good cars in the industry. It was the people who got involved in making them and designing them. It was almost as if in the 60s and 70s, before we had the Suez War and all the inflation, it was almost as if nothing was impossible. People said, well, why don't we make a 2-seater sports car based on the Herald and call it a Spitfire? Fine, we'll do that. And that was done very quickly. As far as the TR was concerned, when they said, okay, we need a new car to meet the American exhaust emission regulations, we should fit a 6-cylinder engine. Okay, we'll do that. It was, I think, again, what the Americans call, it was the way that they had this can-do attitude that always endeared them to me.
That couldn't happen today too easily, could it?
Rules and regulations have changed the world, haven't they? But in those days it seemed that nothing was impossible.
Graham, thank you very much for your time. You've been most gracious with it.
And I'm delighted to be here in North America to talk about it.
Thank you.